Picture this. It's 1918. A German officer crouches in a muddy trench on the Western Front, hands trembling as he writes a letter home. But he's not describing artillery fire or poison gas. He's describing men. Black men. African soldiers advancing across no man's land with a ferocity that defies everything he's been taught about racial superiority. He writes, "They don't stop. Even when we cut them down, they keep coming. God help us, we cannot break them." That letter was intercepted by French intelligence. Decades later, when German military archives were finally declassified, thousands more like it were discovered. An entire army, the most technologically advanced fighting force on Earth, was admitting something in private they could never say in public. They were terrified of African soldiers. This is that story. The story that was buried. The story that changes everything we thought we knew about World War I, about race, about power itself. Let's rewind. The year is 1914, and Europe is burning. World War I has begun, and it's unlike anything humanity has ever seen. This isn't war, it's mechanized slaughter. Machine guns mowing down thousands in minutes, poison gas turning lungs into liquid, artillery shells that can erase entire companies from existence. The French army is hemorrhaging men at a catastrophic rate. Verdun alone will devour 300,000 French soldiers. The Somme will consume even more. French generals are staring at maps covered in red marks, each one representing a position lost, a battalion destroyed. They're running out of men. They're running out of time. Paris itself is in danger of falling. And then someone has an idea. A terrible, brilliant, utterly cynical idea. France controls vast territories in Africa. Millions of people live under French colonial rule in Senegal, Mali, Algeria, Morocco, Chad, Tunisia. People who have been told for decades that they're inferior, uncivilized, incapable of self-governance. People who have been exploited, oppressed, denied basic human rights. Now France needs them. Desperately. Enter the Tirailleurs Sénégalais, the Senegalese riflemen. The name is misleading. These soldiers came from across French West and North Africa, but Senegalese sounded better for propaganda purposes. Between 1914 and 1918, France would recruit over 200,000 African men. Recruit is a generous word. Many were forced. Villages were given quotas. Chiefs were told to provide bodies or face consequences. Young men who had never left their villages, who had never seen an ocean, who had certainly never imagined the frozen hellscape of European winter, were handed rifles and shipped north. Think about the audacity of this for a moment. France had spent decades justifying colonialism by claiming Africans were primitive, childlike, incapable of civilization. French schools taught that white Europeans were the pinnacle of human evolution. Scientists published papers proving that black people were intellectually inferior. And yet here was France, beacon of the Enlightenment, cradle of human rights, desperately conscripting those same inferior people to save them from destruction. The hypocrisy was staggering, but desperation doesn't care about consistency. A French colonel named Charles Mangin had written a book called La Force Noire, the Black Force. In it, he argued that France should create massive African armies. Not because he respected Africans, let's be clear about that. Mangin believed black soldiers were natural warriors, unburdened by imagination or fear of death. He thought they were closer to animals, which made them perfect shock troops. This is what passes for progressive thinking in 1914 France. We should use Africans in war because they're too stupid to be afraid. This was the intellectual framework that sent 200,000 men to die in Europe. So they came. Men from Senegal, from Bambara kingdoms, from the deserts of North Africa, from tropical forests. They were packed onto ships and sent to a continent they'd only heard about in stories. When they arrived in France, many of them had never experienced cold before. Not real cold. Not the bone-deep, soul-crushing cold of a French winter. They were issued uniforms that barely fit, and boots that fell apart in the mud. Their rations were inferior to what white French soldiers received. Their pay was a fraction of what European troops earned. They were housed in separate quarters, treated as second-class soldiers in an army that couldn't survive without them. And then they were sent to the worst places on the Western Front: Verdun, the Somme, Chemin des Dames, names that would become synonymous with slaughter. French commanders used African troops as shock battalions, first-wave attackers whose job was to absorb enemy fire and break through fortified positions. It was a death sentence disguised as a military assignment. The logic was simple and horrifying. African lives were more expendable than French lives. Better to lose 1,000 Senegalese soldiers than 100 Parisians. But something unexpected happened. Something that would terrify the German army and shake the foundations of white supremacy. The African soldiers were devastating in combat, not because they were unthinking savages, but because they were extraordinarily brave, tactically adaptable, and absolutely relentless. German military reports began documenting something alarming. African units weren't breaking under fire. They weren't retreating when positions became untenable. They were holding lines that German commanders assumed would collapse in hours. A captured German intelligence report from 1916 reads, "Negro troops show unusual resistance to suppressive fire. Traditional shock tactics prove less effective against these units. That's military speak for, we can't break them." Another report, this one from 1917. French employment of African colonial troops in forward assault positions has significantly complicated defensive operations. These forces demonstrate aggression levels exceeding European norms. Translation: they fight harder than anyone we've ever faced. The German army had a problem. They'd spent years telling their soldiers that they were the master race, that German military prowess was unmatched, that inferior peoples would crumble before Prussian discipline. And now they were getting mauled by black soldiers from Africa. The cognitive dissonance was unbearable. So Germany did what frightened powers always do. They launched a propaganda campaign. Posters flooded Germany depicting African soldiers as cannibals, as rapists, as subhuman monsters. Newspapers screamed about French perfidy, using savages against civilized white men. It was called defending European values. But read the private letters German soldiers were writing home. Read the diary entries that weren't meant for public consumption. The propaganda was covering for something else entirely. Fear. Raw, genuine, military fear. One German soldier wrote to his wife, "The black French devil troops attack with a fury I cannot describe. They do not fear death as we do. Our machine guns cut them down, and still they come. I have nightmares about their faces." Another, a decorated officer, confided to his journal, "Today, we faced the Senegalese. We held our position, but only barely. I do not know if we can do so again. The men are afraid. I am afraid, though I cannot show it." This wasn't racism expressing itself as casual contempt. This was racism confronting its own lie and panicking. April 1918. The war has been grinding on for 4 years. Germany launches Operation Michael, a massive offensive designed to win the war before American reinforcements can arrive in force. It's Germany's last roll of the dice. For a moment, it works brilliantly. German stormtroopers smash through Allied lines. British and French positions collapse. The road to Paris lies open. If Paris falls, France falls. If France falls, Germany wins the war. The French commanders are desperate. They throw everything they have at the German advance, and at a city called Reims, they deploy the Tirailleurs. the 138th and 43rd Senegalese battalions, along with other African units, are rushed to the front. Their orders are simple and suicidal. Hold the line. Don't retreat. Don't surrender. Just hold. What happened next would be talked about in whispers for decades. The African soldiers dug in. The German army hit them with everything. Artillery bombardment that turned the earth to soup. Poison gas attacks. Wave after wave of infantry assaults. For 3 days, the fighting was apocalyptic. German forces had broken through everywhere else, but at Reims, they stalled. They couldn't advance. Not through the African positions. A German after-action report, stamped confidential and discovered in archives decades later, states, repeated assaults against Negro colonial positions have failed to achieve breakthrough. Enemy resistance exceeds all projections. Recommend tactical revision. That's a German officer admitting defeat without using the word. Another report, more blunt, attack on Reims suspended. Cannot sustain casualties required to overcome African defensive positions. The Tirailleurs held. 60% casualties in some battalions. Men fighting with wounds that should have killed them. Soldiers fixing bayonets and counterattacking when they should have been retreating. They held the line for 3 days. 3 days that gave the Allies time to reinforce, to reorganize, to stop the German offensive. 3 days that arguably saved Paris and changed the trajectory of the entire war. And when the war ended, when the parades marched through Paris and monuments were erected and history was written, the African soldiers were forgotten, erased. White French troops were celebrated. American doughboys were lionized. British Tommies were memorialized. But the Tirailleurs? Footnotes, if that. France held massive victory parades in 1919. African troops were either excluded entirely or hidden in the back, away from the cameras, away from the glory. War memorials went up across France, listing the names of the honored dead. African soldiers' names were often left off or relegated to separate, smaller monuments that nobody visited. And the pensions? White French veterans received generous benefits that increased over time. African veterans? In 1959, France literally froze their pensions at 1959 rates. For decades, men who had saved France received a fraction of what their white comrades earned. But let's talk about what happened in Germany, because this is where the story gets truly revealing. After the war, as part of the occupation, some African troops were stationed in the Rhineland. Germany erupted in outrage. They called it Die Schwarze Schmach, the black shame or the black disgrace. Propaganda portrayed it as the ultimate humiliation. Germany, the land of Beethoven and Goethe, occupied by black African soldiers. The campaign was supposedly about protecting German women from sexual violence. That was the official line. But here's what it really was: a humiliation management operation. Germany couldn't process the psychological wound of losing the war. And they especially couldn't process that they'd been defeated, in part by men they'd been taught to view as subhuman. The Black Shame campaign was Germany screaming to the world and to itself. We didn't really lose to them. We couldn't have. It's impossible. But the private documents tell a different story. When researchers finally got access to German military archives in the 1960s through the 1980s, they found something extraordinary. Memo after memo from German High Command discussing the Negro troop problem. One memo from August 1918 is particularly stunning. The deployment of Negro African troops has proven devastating to morale. Soldiers report these forces fight with a ferocity that cannot be matched. Recommend avoiding direct engagement where possible. Read that again. The German army, considered the finest military machine in the world, was recommending that its soldiers avoid fighting African troops. That's not racism expressing superiority. That's racism confronting evidence of its own falsehood and desperately trying to maintain the lie. And it gets deeper. In the 1990s and 2000s, researchers and historians began excavating World War I battlefields across France. They discovered thousands of unmarked graves. No names, no markers, just bodies buried in haste and forgotten. DNA testing and forensic analysis revealed that many of these graves contained the remains of African soldiers. They had been deliberately excluded from official cemeteries, denied the honors given to white soldiers, buried and erased. Someone made a decision. Multiple someones, actually. Officers, bureaucrats, record keepers. They decided that these men's sacrifices didn't count, that their names didn't deserve to be remembered, that their families didn't deserve to know where they lay. It was systematic erasure on a massive scale. 30 to 40,000 African soldiers died in World War I fighting for France. Tens of thousands more were wounded, maimed, traumatized. 200,000 men were pulled from their homes to save a civilization that viewed them as inferior. And when it was over, that civilization tried to pretend they'd never existed. But here's what makes this story so important, so powerful, so necessary to tell. They failed. The erasure didn't hold. Those German letters and military reports survived. African veterans came home and told their stories, passed them down to their children and grandchildren. Historians kept digging. Activists kept demanding recognition. Unmarked graves were found, mapped, documented. Names were recovered. Stories were reconstructed. And what emerged was a truth that shatters comfortable narratives about race, about power, about who gets to be called heroic. The most technologically advanced army on Earth was afraid of African warriors, not because of racist fantasies about savagery, but because those warriors were genuinely formidable soldiers who refused to break. The propaganda, the black shame hysteria, the desperate attempts to maintain racial hierarchy, all of it was a response to the terrifying reality that white supremacy's fundamental premise had been tested in the crucible of modern warfare and found wanting. Think about what those soldiers did. They fought for a nation that enslaved their homeland. They bled for a flag that denied them citizenship. They died defending a civilization that viewed them as subhuman. And they did it with such courage, such effectiveness, such devastating competence that their enemies spent decades trying to explain it away. The story doesn't end in 1918. Those tirailleurs who survived went home changed. They'd seen Paris. They'd seen white men cry and break and run. They'd proven, to themselves, to each other, that the colonial mythology was a lie. Seeds were planted. When World War II came, another 200,000 African soldiers fought for France. And after that war, those seeds began to sprout. Independence movements, revolutions. Leaders like Léopold Sédar Senghor, who had served as a tirailleur, became the first president of an independent Senegal. The great-grandchildren of those World War I soldiers are alive today, living in free nations that threw off colonial rule. So the next time someone tells you that Africa has no history, no heroes, no military tradition, remember the German officer trembling in his trench. Remember the propaganda designed to mask fear. Remember 200,000 men who crossed an ocean to save an empire that tried to erase them. They fought for a France that refused to claim them as equals. But history claims them now. We claim them now. Their names are being recovered, carved into new monuments, taught in schools, told in stories like this one. The erasure failed. The truth survived. And it's a truth that changes everything. When white supremacy was tested in the ultimate arena, total war, life and death, survival itself, it lost. The master race whispered in fear about black soldiers. And no amount of propaganda, no historical revision, no comfortable mythology can undo that fact. They held the line at Reims. They saved Paris. They helped win the war. And now, finally, after a century of lies, we remember. We honor. We refuse to let them be forgotten again. Their blood is in French soil. Their names are returning to monuments. Their story is being told. And every time we tell it, we strike another blow against the forces that tried to bury them. That's the power of memory. That's the power of truth. That's why this story matters. They were called the Black Shame, but they were actually the Black Victory that Europe couldn't acknowledge until now.